The wheat fields of Harveth smelled different before sunrise, not like the day, not like the afternoon wind that carried dust and dry grass across the plains. Before sunrise, the air was cool and still, and the wheat stood straight and quiet like it was listening for something. Nora Aldwin had been waking up before sunrise for 63 years. She did not need an alarm. Her body had learned long ago that the dark hours before dawn belonged to her. She would rise from her small bed, pull her wool cardigan over her shoulders, slide her feet into the worn leather slippers that sat beside the door, and walk the 12 steps from her bedroom to her bakery. Those 12 steps were the same every morning. Creaky third board, cold tile at the doorway, the familiar smell of stone and flour, and the faint sweetness of yesterday's baked goods that still clung to the walls. She liked those 12 steps. They reminded her that she was still here. Harveth was not a beautiful planet, not the way the travel broadcasts sometimes made frontier colonies sound. It had no sparkling seas or dramatic mountain ranges glowing under twin moons. What it had was flat land, wide sky, and honest people who had come from a dozen different parts of Earth to try to build something far from home. The colony town of Harveth Settlement was small, just a few hundred people, with low stone buildings, one medical center, a market row, and Nora's bakery at the eastern edge, where the town gave way to the open wheat plains. She had come here with her husband, Aldrich, 41 years ago. He was gone now, 7 years past, taken by a heart that had simply worked too long and too hard. Her daughter lived on a station 3-star systems away. Her son had settled on a colony even farther than that. They called when they could. She understood. Life moved people. She had her bakery. She pressed the starter on the stone oven, and the old machine hummed to life, warming slowly the way old things do. She measured flour with both hands, the way she had always done, not by machine weight, but by feel. 63 years of baking meant her hands knew the difference between too much and not enough without being told. She had begun mixing the second batch of morning bread when she heard it. Not a loud sound, it was far from loud. It was the kind of sound that slipped under the door rather than knocking on it. A low, slow vibration, almost like a growl, but not with anger behind it, more like something that had been trying to stay quiet for a long time and was finally too tired to keep trying. Nora stopped mixing. She stood still in her flour-dusted apron and listened. It came again, low, deep, and trembling, coming from behind the back wall of the bakery where her small yard met the edge of the wheat field. She set down the wooden bowl and wiped her hands on her apron. It was not long after this that Governor Bryn appeared at her front door, which was unusual, because Governor Bryn did not typically appear anywhere before mid-morning, and certainly not in a state of breathless alarm with 2 colony security officers at his back. He was a thin man with a forgettable face that was currently quite red. He spoke quickly and with his hands. There had been a detection, long-range atmospheric scanner, a juvenile Vorkai somewhere near the eastern edge of the settlement, probably lost, possibly injured, definitely dangerous. The Vorkai were a protected species under cooperative law, but that did not mean a frightened hatchling was safe to approach. One panicked juvenile could put a hole through a stone building with a single uncontrolled flame burst. He was ordering the eastern perimeter sealed. All businesses on the colony edge were to close their external vents, lock their back access points, and stay inside until the clan recovery team arrived, which could be anywhere between 6 hours and 2 days, depending on signal relay speed through this sector. He looked at her flour-covered hands and the open mixing bowl on the counter. He asked her, quite pointedly, if she understood. Nora told him she understood perfectly. He told her again, anyway. She nodded, thanked him for coming personally, and after he left with his officers, she turned back to her bread bowl and continued mixing. She was not careless. She had heard every word Governor Bryn said. She knew what the Vorkai were. Everyone on Harveth knew. They were the oldest spacefaring species in this sector, dragonkin in every real sense of the word, vast and scaled and ancient, with tempers as hot as the fire they carried in their chests. The Galactic Cooperative had been trying to negotiate proper diplomatic relations with the Vorkai clans for over 60 years, and the progress had been, by all accounts, extremely slow. She also knew what she had heard through her back wall. It was not the sound of something dangerous. It was the sound of something that hurt. She had raised 2 children. She had sat with her husband through 3 illnesses. She had fed frightened colonists on the night of the first bad storm, and on the anniversary of the day, the Harvard Central transport collapsed and took 11 people with it. She had fed people at births and at funerals and at the quiet, ordinary disasters that did not make headlines. She knew what need sounded like. The bread needed 15 more minutes of rest before shaping. She covered it with the cloth and set the timer. Then she went to her back window and looked out at the yard. The wheat beyond the stone wall was still dark in the pre-dawn, but something was there, pressed into the shadow right against the base of the wall. She could not see it clearly, but she could see that it was large and that it was shaking. She turned back to her oven. She checked the temperature. She checked the bread. She thought about what she had and what might help and what a body needed when it had been cold and alone for too long. Then she pulled the first finished loaf from the rack where it had been cooling, the one she had baked an hour earlier, the one that was still warm all the way through. She picked it up. She walked to the back door. She put her hand on the latch. Outside, the wheat fields of Harvard were beginning to turn grey-gold at the edges as the first light of the planet's slow sunrise started somewhere beyond the horizon. The sound behind the wall had gone quiet, the way frightened things go quiet when they hear footsteps coming. Nora opened the door. There are things in the universe that no training prepares you for. Pilots learn to read stellar drift. Doctors learn to work in zero gravity. Diplomats learn to bow in 14 different ways depending on the species across the table. Soldiers learn to hold still when they are afraid. No one in 63 years of life had ever taught Nora Aldwin what to do when she opened her back door and found a dragon in her yard. And yet she did not drop the bread. He was pressed into the far corner of the stone yard, where the bakery wall met the old wooden fence she kept meaning to repair. In the pale grey light of early morning, he looked like a piece of the stone itself, dark and still and heavy. His scales were deep copper along his back and sides, fading to a dull grey at his underbelly, and they were dull in the way that scales were not supposed to be dull. They should have caught light and thrown it back. Instead, they sat flat and dim against his skin, the way everything about an exhausted body goes flat and dim when it has been running too long on nothing. He was, by the size of him, not yet fully grown, but that was a relative thing. He was still large enough that his folded body filled most of the small yard, and one of his wings, slightly bent at an awkward angle as though it had been landed on wrong, pressed against the fence and made the old wood groan. His eyes were open. They were amber, deep metallic amber, the color of old coins, with a vertical pupil that caught what little light there was and made it glow. And those eyes were fixed on Nora with an intensity that a lesser woman might have described as terrifying. The translator collar around his thick neck, standard galactic cooperative issue for juvenile non-human species who might wander into contact zones, clicked and buzzed and produced a garbled string of sound that was almost language. 3 different warning phrases from 3 different languages crashed into each other and came out as something that meant roughly, danger, do not, warning, turn, leave, fire, stay back. Nora looked at the collar, she looked at the dragon, she looked at the bread in her hands. She took 1 step forward. The amber eyes widened, the deep copper chest expanded with a breath. A thin ribbon of smoke curled up from one nostril and then the other. The broken wing pressed harder against the fence, making the wood crack. The sound that came from his throat was low and long, and it was the sound of something that very much wanted to be terrifying and was using everything it had left to try. Nora stopped, not from fear. She stopped because she recognized that sound too. It was the sound of something using its last energy to protect itself. She had seen it in cornered animals on Harvard's plains. She had seen it in sick people who were too tired to be sick anymore but kept going because stopping felt like giving up. The bravado of exhaustion, the growl that comes not from strength, but from the last scrap of dignity a creature has left when everything else is gone. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself lower, and she set the bread on the stone ground between them. She did not push it forward, she did not hold it out, she just set it down, and she sat back on her heels, and she waited. The amber eyes dropped to the bread. The smoke from his nostrils thinned. A Varkai hatchling did not eat grain. Nora did not know this in any scientific sense, but she suspected it, the way you suspect that a cat does not want what you are offering when it turns its head away. What she also knew, from 63 years of watching people and creatures and every living thing that had ever come through her kitchen door, was that warmth is not only about food. The bread was still warm. She had checked before she picked it up. It was the kind of warm that travels from the crust through the air and reaches you before you reach it. The kind of warm that means someone was awake before the sun and working while you slept, and they made this for whoever needed it. The hatchling's nostrils moved. He breathed in, long and slow and careful. The smoke stopped. His chest dropped as the breath left him, not in fire, just in air, and his eyes did not leave the bread. He stretched his neck forward just slightly. The collar buzzed. He pulled back. Then he stretched forward again. He took the bread in one careful motion, not violent, not snatching, but careful, the way something tries to take a thing without committing to the taking in case it turns out to be a trap. He held it for one moment in the space between his teeth. Then he ate it. He ate it in 2 bites, and it was not graceful, and it did not fill him, but when it was gone something in his body changed in the small visible way that warmth changes things. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His wings stopped pressing against the fence. The ribbon of smoke did not return. Nora stood up and went back inside. She came out 2 minutes later with 2 more loaves from the cooling rack and a deep clay bowl filled with warm salted water she had mixed from the kitchen tap. She set both down in the same spot. She sat on the old wooden crate she kept by the back wall, the one she used when she sat outside in the evenings, and she crossed her hands in her lap. The hatchling drank the water first, all of it without stopping. Then he ate the 2 loaves slower this time without the desperate edge. The salt in the water was doing something useful. She could not have said what exactly. She was not a Varkai physician, but his color was better, just slightly. The way a face gets a little more color after a drink of water when it has been too pale for too long. Nora talked while he ate, not at him, not about him, just the way she talked to herself when she was working, which was most of the time. She talked about the wheat, which had come in thin this year because of the dry season. She talked about her neighbor Old Dunn, who had complained for the 4th time this month that her bread was too salty, which she felt was his problem and not hers. She talked about the crack in the ceiling above her oven that she had been meaning to have looked at for 3 years now. The hatchling's translator collar clicked occasionally. It was not catching enough of her words to produce anything coherent. It did not matter. He was listening anyway. Not to the words, to the sound of her, the rhythm of a voice that was calm when everything else in his last 2 days had been loud and wrong and frightening. He had crashed a landing on the rocky ridge 3 miles east when the wind caught his bent wing wrong. He had walked because he could not fly. He had walked away from the crash site and toward the smell of something warm because he did not know what else to do. He had found this. An old woman, a warm yard, water, bread that was not what he was supposed to eat, but was warm and was given without anything being asked in return. When the second loaf was gone, he put his head down. Not slowly, not carefully, just down, the great copper and grey weight of it, settling onto the stone ground of Nora's small yard with a sound like a heavy stone laid to rest. His amber eyes drifted partly closed. The broken wing relaxed against the fence. The translator collar ticked once and went quiet. Nora watched him settle. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out the small square of wool she carried with her everywhere. The beginning of a pair of socks she was knitting for her grandson who lived 4 star systems away and would probably not wear them but would keep them anyway. She picked up her needles. She began to knit. The sun came up over the wheat fields of Harveth, slow and pale gold, and it lit up the bakery yard and the sleeping hatchling and the old woman sitting on her crate with her needles moving in the quiet morning air. Inside the bakery, the timer went off for the next batch of bread. Nora did not move. The bread could wait. Cale found the trail at the base of the eastern ridge, where the grass was pressed flat in a wide, irregular pattern, and the soil carried the faint heat trace that a Vorkai body left behind wherever it rested. He was young, 22 years old in Vorkai reckoning, which made him roughly an adult in terms of size and not quite an adult in terms of sense, a fact his mother had pointed out to him 3 times before he left the nest. He had been searching for 2 days. Drail was his younger brother, 8 years old, barely past the crawling stage in Vorkai terms, and he had done the single most foolish thing a hatchling could do during a group flight. He had followed a wind current that went sideways, gotten turned around above the cloud layer, come down too fast on a broken wing, and disappeared somewhere over a human settlement. Cale had spent those 2 days telling himself that his brother was probably fine, and then not believing it, and then telling himself again more firmly. It had not worked. He had covered 60 miles of terrain and had not slept. When the heat trail on the grass turned toward the cluster of low stone buildings at the edge of the plains, his stomach dropped. A human settlement of all the places. The cooperative had protocols. There would be panic. There would be security. There might be weapons. Drail was a child and he was lost, and he had no idea how to behave around a species he had never met, and humans were, by every account Cale had ever heard, entirely unpredictable in moments of stress. He moved fast and low along the edge of the wheat field, keeping to the cover of the tall grain, following the trail toward a small stone building at the very edge of the settlement. A bakery, from the smell of it, warm and yeasty and oddly comforting in the middle of his fear. The trail went around the back of the building. He followed it. He came around the corner of the stone wall with his talons extended and the fire in his chest already building, because he was scared, and being scared in a Vorkai came out as ready to destroy everything in the immediate area, and he pulled up hard and stopped dead. Drail was asleep. His little brother, the source of 2 days of absolute terror, was lying in a small stone yard with his head on the ground and his broken wing resting loose against a wooden fence, and he was asleep, not the restless half-sleep of something hurt and frightened, properly asleep. The deep, heavy, gone completely sleep of a creature that has been fed and warmed and let down its guard entirely. And beside him, sitting on a wooden crate with 2 sticks in her hands moving in a quiet rhythm, was a human. Old, very old by human standards. White hair pinned up at the back of her head, a long apron dusted with something pale, a cardigan the color of old moss, small enough that she could have sat in the space between Drail's front claws with room to spare. She looked up at Cale when he came around the corner, not with the expression he had come to expect from humans in close contact with Vorkai, not the wide eyes and the stepping back and the reaching for a communication device to call for help. She looked up at him the way someone looks up from their work when a neighbor arrives at an inconvenient moment. Mildly, without alarm. Cale did not know what to do with that, so he did what came naturally when he did not know what to do, which was be aggressive. He demanded to know what she had done to his brother. The translator on his collar rendered it in cooperative standard. The old woman watched the collar as it spoke, then looked back at him, then at Drail, then at him again. She said something. Her collar, a civilian-issue visitor band that most humans in cooperative contact zones wore out of habit, translated it plainly. She said he was hungry. I gave him bread. Cale looked at his sleeping brother. He looked at the clay bowl on the ground, empty. He looked at the crumbs on the stones. He said, bread. She said, yes. He said, that is not what Vorkai eat. She said, I know, but it was warm and he needed something warm. Cale stared at her. His fire had cooled completely during this exchange without him noticing. He tried to locate some anger to replace it with, and found that he was mostly just confused. He looked at Drail again. He studied his brother's coloring, the way the scales lay, the rise and fall of his chest. He was not a physician, but he knew his own brother, and what he saw was a hatchling who was not simply unconscious from exhaustion. The tension was gone from Drail's body in a way that only happened when something felt genuinely safe. A Varkai hatchling in danger, even asleep, kept its muscles ready, its claws partly extended, its head at an angle where the eyes could open fast. Drail's claws were flat, his head was resting fully on the ground, his neck was loose. He had trusted something here. Kale could not remember the last time Drail had slept that way at home. He crouched down slowly, which with a full-grown young Varkai was still an enormous reduction in height that made the yard feel suddenly very small, and he studied the old woman more closely. She had not moved from her crate. Her hands had gone still on the knitting, but she was not gripping it nervously. She just sat. He asked her why she had not called the security office. She said, "I had bread to bake." He asked her if she had not been afraid. She thought about that for a moment in a way that seemed genuine rather than polite. Then she said, "He was shaking. Things that are shaking are not things I am afraid of. They are things I feed." Kale was quiet for a long time. He became aware that he had been crouching in a human bakery yard, having a conversation with an elderly woman who was not afraid of him, and that his brother was asleep at her feet, and that the yard smelled of bread and warm stone, and that he had not eaten in 2 days either. The woman stood up from her crate, which took her a moment because her knees were the slow kind, and she went inside. She came back out carrying something, a loaf of bread, darker than the ones Drail had eaten, heavy with a thick crust. She set it on the ground in front of him the same way she must have set them in front of Drail, not pushed at him, just placed down and left there. She went back to her crate and sat down and picked up her knitting. Kale looked at the bread. He was not going to eat it. He was a warrior, and it was grain, and he had his dignity. He remained very still for a time, demonstrating his dignity. The bread sat there. It smelled warm. He had not eaten in 2 days. His dignity was tired. He ate the bread. He did not admit afterward that it helped, but it did. It was somewhere in this moment that Governor Bryn arrived with his 2 security officers, having received a report from a colony scanner that showed a second large heat signature in the bakery yard. He came around the corner with a data pad full of emergency protocol codes, took one look at Kale, and stopped so suddenly that one of his officers walked into his back. He began reciting emergency contact procedures and interspecies diplomatic buffer zone requirements, his voice going higher with each line. Kale turned to look at him, which was enough to make one of the officers take 3 large steps backward. Nora did not look up from her knitting. She said, "Bryn, go back inside and put the kettle on, please." Governor Bryn opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the 2 Varkai. He looked at Nora. He looked at the empty bread bowl on the ground. He said, "Nora, there are 2 of them now." She said, "Yes, go put the kettle on." He went. His officers went with him. One of them looked back twice. Kale watched the human administrator leave. He watched the old woman knit. He looked at his sleeping brother. He looked at the empty loaf spot on the ground in front of him. He was a young Varkai warrior who had learned that his kind were the oldest and most powerful species in this sector, and that humans were small and soft and lived such brief lives that it was difficult to take them seriously. He had believed this in the complete, uncomplicated way that you believe things that no one has ever shown you a reason to doubt. He sat down in the bakery yard. He did not know what to believe anymore. Drail slept on, undisturbed, warm and safe, in the yard of an old woman who had not asked either of them for a single thing. The sun was fully up now over Harveth. The wheat fields caught the morning light and held it, gold all the way to the horizon. Somewhere in the bakery, the kettle was beginning to boil. In the colony's small administrative office, 3 days after the morning Nora opened her back door, Governor Bryn sat at his desk and filed what he called a routine incident report to the Galactic Cooperative Regional Office. He called it routine because he did not know what else to call it. In the box marked Nature of Incident he wrote, Juvenile Varkai recovered safely at Eastern Perimeter, no property damage, no injuries, no diplomatic breach. In the box marked resolution he wrote, matter resolved by local resident. In the box marked follow-up required he wrote, unclear. He stared at that last entry for a while. Then he submitted the report and went to find something to eat because he had not had a proper meal in 3 days due to the stress of having 2 enormous alien dragons sitting in his colony's bakery yard eating bread. They were still there. Drail the hatchling had not left. His wing was better, not healed fully, but the wrong angle had come right on its own the way young bones sometimes do, and he could fold it flat again, and he spent his days in the yard or in the wheat field just beyond the fence where he could lie down fully. He did not venture into the settlement. He stayed close to the bakery wall. Kale had sent his recovery report to the clan relay station on the second morning, which was standard procedure. The Varkai were meticulous about their young. Every clan kept a dedicated communication relay for hatchling situations, and Kale's report went through the channel encrypted and direct to the clan nest. He had used few words, as Varkai warriors generally did when writing official reports. He wrote Drail recovered, minor injury healing, location, human colony, Harvath settlement, Eastern Rim, status, stable, reason for delay in return, hatchling is unwilling to leave. He added one more line, which was not standard in recovery reports, which had no official place in the clan communication format, and which he wrote anyway because he could not make it fit inside any proper category. He wrote, a human woman found him, she fed the cold. He sent it, he did not explain what he meant, he did not know how to explain it. In Old Varkai, the phrase he used was ancient, older than the colony worlds, older than the cooperative, older than the treaties and the border disputes and the long complicated history of the Varkai clans dealing with the rest of the galaxy. It went back to the deep nest traditions, to the time before the Varkai flew among the stars, when a cold hatchling on a winter night could mean a dead hatchling by morning, and the elder of the nest, who stayed awake to keep the young ones warm, was performing an act that was sacred and without price. She fed the cold meant she gave warmth to something that had none, and she asked for nothing back. It was not a phrase used lightly. It was not a phrase any Varkai warrior expected to ever apply to a human being. The message traveled through the relay chain at standard signal speed. It reached the clan nest coordinator on the Varkai home station within 18 hours. The coordinator read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it, unaltered, to Elder Sorath's personal communication archive with a single attached note of her own. The note said, I did not know what else to do with this. Elder Sorath's archive received thousands of messages a week. He was 340 years old, the oldest living Varkai in the current clan line, and his days were consumed by the administration of a species that had been managing its own affairs for longer than most civilizations in this sector had existed. He did not read every message personally. His staff filtered them. This one came through unfiltered, marked urgent by the coordinator, and he read it on a quiet evening when most of his staff had gone, and the station was settling into the low hum of its night cycle. He read it 3 times. Then he sat with it for a very long time. In the Galactic Cooperative Diplomatic Corps, the incident report from Harvath Settlement had made its way through 3 different department desks and landed on the workstation of a junior analyst named Paul, who was 26 years old and had been assigned to the Varkai diplomatic file for 4 months. Paul read Governor Bryn's report, noted the unusual element in the resolution box, and added a line of his own to the internal case file. He wrote, possible goodwill signal from Varkai recovery team, nature unclear, recommend monitoring. He had no idea what he had written. In the colony itself, the story moved the way stories move in small communities, from mouth to ear, from kitchen to market row, from Dunn's front porch to the medical center steps. People who had lived on Harvath for years and had grown used to the theoretical proximity of Varkai nesting grounds without ever seeing one up close now found themselves with something real to talk about. An old woman, 2 dragons, bread. No one had been hurt. Nothing had been destroyed. The version the colonists told to each other was simple because the truth was simple. Nora Aldwin had found a hurt creature behind her wall and she had fed it. She had not called for help, not because she was careless, but because she had not needed to. She had handled it the way she handled everything, quietly, practically, with whatever she had in her kitchen. People found this either completely unsurprising or absolutely remarkable, depending on how well they knew Nora. Those who knew her well were, in the completely unsurprising camp. 3 journalists from the Cooperative Broadcasting Network filed requests to visit Harvath settlement for a profile piece. Governor Bryn's office received all 3 requests and forwarded them to Nora. Nora sent back one response to all 3. It said, "No thank you." She did not elaborate. The journalists came anyway, hoping she would change her mind when they arrived in person. She gave them each a roll from the morning batch, told them she was very busy, and went back inside. One of the journalists, a woman named Fen, who covered Outer Stories for the Cooperative's Eastern Broadcast region, wrote the piece anyway without an interview. She kept it short. She wrote that in a colony at the edge of explored space, an elderly baker had done something that 60 years of cooperative diplomacy had not. She had made a Vaokai feel safe enough to sleep. The piece ran in the mid-tier broadcast tier, which meant it was not headline news, but was not buried either. It reached approximately 400,000 readers across 11 colony systems. One of those readers was a retired cooperative diplomat named Aldous, who had spent 30 years trying to negotiate with the Vaokai clans. He read the piece twice and then sat very quietly at his desk for several minutes and did not say anything to anyone. Then he forwarded it to his old colleague at the Diplomatic Corps main office with one line, "Look at what one loaf of bread did." Inside Nora's bakery, none of this was known to Nora because she did not follow the broadcasts and she did not check her communication inbox very often. She was baking. She was always baking. In the evenings, she sat in the yard on her crate and Drayle would lie beside the fence and she would talk about whatever was in her head and he would listen to the sound of her voice and the translator would do its imperfect best. Cale would sit against the far wall and pretend he was not listening. He was always listening. On the 3rd evening, Cale asked her something that he had been carrying since the morning he arrived. He asked, "Why did you not let the security office handle it?" She thought about it. She set down her knitting. She looked at the hatchlings sleeping by the fence. She said, because by the time they arrived with their protocols and their procedures and their emergency contact forms, he would have been alone for another 4 hours in the cold. And I was already here, and I had bread. Cale was quiet. He said it could have gone badly if he had been older or more frightened. She said, "Yes, a lot of things could go badly. I do not spend much time with things that have not happened yet." Cale thought about that. On the 4th morning, a new message arrived in the Harvath Settlement administrative system. It did not go to Governor Bryn's inbox. It bypassed the standard diplomatic channels entirely, which should not have been possible, but apparently was, when you were 340 years old and had enough network access to route a message however you chose. It was addressed to the baker at the eastern edge of the settlement. It said, "I am coming to Harvath. I would like to meet the woman who fed the cold. I will arrive in 6 days. I require no formal reception, no diplomatic escort, and no prepared statements. I require only to know where the bakery is." It was signed, Sorath, Elder of the Vaokai, 3rd Bloodline. Governor Bryn saw it only because the system flagged incoming messages from Vaokai origin points and copied his office automatically. He read it. He read it again. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked the length of the settlement to Nora's bakery. She was pulling bread from the oven when he came in. She listened to him read the message aloud. She nodded when he finished. She asked, "Should I bake extra?" Governor Bryn opened his mouth. He closed it. He said yes, he thought she should probably bake extra. She turned back to the oven. Outside, in the yard, Drayle lifted his head and looked toward the sky in the direction of a point so far away it could not be seen. The way young things sometimes feel when something important is moving toward them across the dark. Then he put his head back down. The bread was ready, and the yard was warm, and there was nowhere else he wanted to be. 6 days later, something entered Harvath's orbit. It appeared on the long-range scanner at the colony administrative office at 3 in the morning local time, which meant Governor Bryn was woken from a shallow and anxious sleep by his alert system and sat up in bed staring at a reading that made no immediate sense. The vessel was enormous, not warship enormous, not even transport ship enormous, the kind of enormous that had no category in the colony's scanner index because nothing that size had ever come within scanner range of Harvath before. The system flagged it as unknown classification and continued to flag it every 30 seconds in a small, increasingly irritating chime until Bryn got up and went to his office to deal with it. The vessel requested landing coordinates at 4 in the morning, not through standard cooperative channels, through a private encoded frequency that the Harvath system had no record of ever receiving before, but which the communications array accepted without complaint, as though it recognized something very old and very certain. The landing request came with a single line of text. It said, "Near the bakery of Nora Aldwin." Governor Bryn had spent the 6 days since the message arrived trying to prepare for this. He had arranged a formal reception with colony flags and a drafted welcome speech. He had contacted the Cooperative Diplomatic Corps Regional Office and received, in reply, a message that managed to convey extreme interest and complete inability to help simultaneously. He had asked Kale, still in residence in Nora's yard, what an appropriate greeting for a Vorkai elder would be, and Kale had told him that Elder Sorath did not particularly care about greetings, and that if Bryn wanted to make a good impression, he should simply stay out of the way. Bryn had found this unhelpful. The vessel landed at dawn, on the open flat ground east of the bakery, where the wheat fields gave way to a wide dirt clearing used for colony supply drops. It came down slowly and with a precision that was almost frightening, something that large moving with that much control, like watching a mountain decide where it wanted to sit. The settlement shook slightly when it touched ground. Windows rattled. A row of supply crates in the market storage shifted on their shelves. When the landing ramp opened, Elder Sorath came down it alone. There were no guards, no attendants, no diplomatic staff, just him, and even alone he was enough. He was enormous in the way that makes the word enormous feel like it is not doing the work it needs to do. 4 times the size of Kale, which meant he stood at a height that made the bakery's stone wall look like something you could step over without noticing. His scales were black, but not a simple black, the way deep space is not a simple black. They had depth, layers of darkness with a faint iridescent sheen that caught the early morning light and shifted it into colors that did not have names in any human language. His horns were long and worn smooth at the tips, the way old things get smooth from years of contact with the world. His eyes were the color of a dying star, deep amber going to red at the outer edges, and they moved slowly and with great weight, taking in the settlement, the wheat fields, the bakery, and then Nora. The colony's formal reception was waiting at the edge of the clearing, Governor Bryn in front with his speech in hand, 2 flag bearers at his sides, a line of colony representatives behind him, all of them doing their best to stand steady and not visibly tremble, which was a significant personal achievement given the circumstances. Sorath looked at them. He looked at Nora's bakery. He walked past the reception. Governor Bryn lowered his speech. The flag bearers exchanged a glance. Nobody said anything. Sorath went around the side of the bakery to the backyard, where Nora was sitting on her crate in the morning light with a cup of something warm and her knitting in her lap, as though she had been expecting him at precisely this time. Drail was lying by the fence. When the old elder came around the wall, Drail lifted his head and made a sound in his throat that Kale had never heard from his brother before, something low and warm. Recognition. The sound of a young creature who has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Sorath looked at the hatchling for a long moment with those old star-colored eyes. Something passed between them that was private, the way things between elders and young ones are always partly private. Then he turned to Nora. He was so large that when he lowered himself into a resting position in the yard, which he did slowly, with the deliberate care of something that has learned to be careful around small spaces. He still filled most of it. His head came down to roughly the height of the bakery roof. He looked at Nora from there, and she looked up at him, and the size difference between them was so extreme that it was almost funny. Nora said, "You must be his grandfather." There was a pause. The translator on the elder's collar was not the standard cooperative issue. It was old and finely made, and it worked in both directions with a clarity that standard collars never achieved. His voice came through it deep and measured, like stone rolling slowly over stone. He said, "I am the elder of his bloodline. What you call grandfather is not far from the truth." He said, "I came a very long way to understand what you did." Nora thought about it the way she thought about things, honestly and without performing modesty. Then she said, "I do not think I did much. He was behind my wall. He was cold and he was shaking and he had not eaten. I had bread. That was the whole of it." Sorath was quiet for a time. He said, "In 340 years, I have never heard those words from anyone who was not Vorkai. Every kindness given to my kind by another species came with a price attached, an alliance, a trade agreement, access to our star charts, something. There is always something. This is the way of things in the galaxy. We learned long ago not to trust warmth from strangers because the warmth was never free." Nora looked at him. She said, "The bread was already made. It would have been a waste to throw it out." Something happened in the old elder's face that was difficult to read because his face was the face of something ancient and armored and not built for small expressions. But it happened. A shift somewhere behind those dying star eyes. Something that in a human face would have been the beginning of a smile, or maybe the beginning of tears, or maybe both at once. He said, "My kind call what you did by a very old name. Kale used it in his report, and I did not believe him until I came here and saw it for myself. He said you fed the cold. In our oldest traditions, that act is sacred. It is what nest mothers do. It is what elders do for the young in their care. It does not have a value because it cannot be priced. It is given or it is not given. There is no middle." Nora listened. She did not look away. She said, "Where I come from we call it being decent. It is not complicated." The old dragon was quiet again. The morning wind moved through the wheat field beyond the fence. Drail had shifted, moving closer to Sorath without seeming to notice he was doing it, the way young ones move toward the old ones without thinking about it, pulled by something older than decision. They talked for a long time after that. Not about politics, not about the 60 years of stalled diplomacy between the cooperative and the Vorkai clans, though it sat in the background of the conversation the way large things sometimes sit just outside the circle of firelight, present without being named. They talk the way two people who are both very old talk when they find someone who understands what oldness costs, the things you carry, the things you have outlived. The work you keep doing not because it is grand, but because it is yours, and because your hands know how to do it, and stopping would mean something you are not ready for. Sorath talked about the 3 clan elders he had watched leave the world in his 300 years. He talked about a star he had seen go dark when he was very young, a star his own nest mother had pointed out to him as a fixed point, something permanent, and how he still sometimes looked for it. Nora talked about Aldrich, about the way his hands looked when he worked, about the crack in her bakery ceiling that she had never fixed because he was the one who fixed things and she had not been able to decide what it meant to fix it without him. The old dragon listened. He did not offer solutions. He just listened, which is what you do when you understand that some things do not need solutions. Before he rose to leave, Sorath reached into a sealed compartment on his chest harness, a place where important things were kept close. He removed a stone. It was small, smaller than Nora's fist, but it glowed with a steady, deep warmth, red gold, like something with a fire inside it that had been burning for a very long time. He set it on the ground in front of her. He said, "This is a Vorkai firestone. The warmth inside it does not come from a fuel that burns up. It comes from the mineral itself. It will burn at that temperature for approximately 1,000 years." He said, for your oven, so the bread does not go cold. Nora looked at the stone. She picked it up. It was perfectly warm in her palm, exactly the temperature of something just taken from the oven, the temperature that stays in bread long enough to comfort the person eating it. She said, thank you, this will save me a great deal on heating costs. Sorath looked at her for a long moment. Then the sound came from his chest again, deep and low and grinding, the same sound Kale had made in the yard days ago. Laughter, old and genuine. He rose, he walked to Drail and lowered his great head, and the hatchling pressed his own small forehead against the elder's jaw and closed his eyes and made the same low warm sound as before. It lasted only a moment. Then Sorath straightened and moved through the back gate of the yard, which was too small for him by any reasonable measurement, but he moved through it anyway with the quiet certainty of something that does not let dimensions stop it. He went back around the bakery wall toward his vessel. He passed Governor Bryn and his reception committee, who were still standing exactly where he had left them, the flags now slightly drooping. He stopped. He looked at Bryn for the first time. He said, your baker is a remarkable woman. You should take better care of her. Then he walked on. Governor Bryn stood very still holding his undelivered speech. Behind the bakery wall, Nora turned the firestone over in her hands, feeling its steady warmth, and then she walked back inside to place it in the oven, where it sat and glowed and did exactly what it was made to do. That evening, she baked the best bread she had made in 40 years. She did not know if it was the stone or something else. She did not think about it too long. She left a loaf on the outside sill where Drail could reach it. He found it before the night had fully settled over the wheat fields of Harveth, and he ate it in the dark, and the warmth of it stayed with him all the way until morning. 6 months after the morning Nora opened her back door, a document arrived at the Galactic Cooperative Diplomatic Corps main office on the Central Station. It was not long. Cooperative diplomatic documents were usually long because the people who wrote them got paid by complexity, and the people who read them had staff who summarized. This one was 4 pages. The cover note attached to it said only, Framework for Renewed Engagement between the Galactic Cooperative and the Vorkai clans, submitted at the personal recommendation of Elder Sorath, 3rd Bloodline. It sat on the desk of the head of the Vorkai Affairs Division, who had held that position for 11 years and who had spent the majority of those 11 years navigating a relationship that moved, when it moved at all, like ice over flat ground. She read all 4 pages twice. Then she called her deputy into the office and told him to clear her afternoon schedule. She said, something changed. I do not know what changed or when it changed, but something did. Her deputy, who had done his own reading and who had come across the small Outer Rim broadcast piece by journalist Fenn about the Harveth colony baker, said quietly, I might know. The document went through the diplomatic process over the following weeks, as documents do, with reviews and amendments and careful language. But it moved. For the first time in over 60 years, it moved. People who had worked in Vorkai diplomacy their entire careers used words like unprecedented and unexpected, and in the case of one very tired senior analyst who had been working the file for 20 years, finally said softly at his desk late one night when no one else was around to hear it. The treaty was not finished in 6 months. These things never finish in 6 months, but the framework was agreed. The basic terms were set. The foundation existed where no foundation had existed before, and that was a different thing entirely from where things had stood. In the official record of how this happened, the Harveth incident appeared in a footnote, a single sentence. It said, informal contact between Harveth settlement residents and a juvenile Vorkai recovery party contributed to an improved relational climate. That was all. Diplomatic records did not tend toward poetry. Kale's report in the Vorkai clan communication archive was more honest. His account of the recovery mission, which was required reading for all junior Vorkai warriors who would be operating near human settlements for the following 3 years, contained one paragraph that was not standard to recovery reports. It said, The human resident who found the hatchling did not call for help, did not reach for a weapon, and did not ask what she would receive in return. She recognized need, and she answered it. I did not understand this at the time. I understand it better now. It is not weakness. It is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. Several senior HFY warriors who reviewed the report flagged that paragraph. None of them removed it. On Harveth itself, life continued in the way of small colony life, which is to say steadily, with small dramas and ordinary work and the long rhythm of seasons on a planet that was not Earth, but that had become home to the people who stayed long enough. The treaty designation came through in the 4th month after Sorath's visit. Harveth settlement was formally listed as a HFY-protected colony, the first human settlement in history to carry that classification. What it meant in practical terms was that no HFY clan would threaten, ignore, or deny assistance to Harveth under any circumstances. The colony was, in the oldest sense of the HFY honor code, under the nest's protection. Governor Bryn received the notification at his desk on a Wednesday morning and sat with it for a long time before he called anyone. Then he called Nora. She said, "That is very good news, Bryn. Does this mean the Eastern Perimeter Sensor can go back to general use?" He said yes, it could. She said, "Good. The alerts have been waking me up every time Drail comes back from the ridge." Drail came back every season. He was growing fast, the way hatchlings did when they were fed well and not afraid, and each visit he was larger than the last. By the time winter came to Harveth's plains, he could not fit through the back gate anymore and had taken to simply stepping over the fence, which he did with great care, though the fence did not always survive. Nora kept repairing it. She did not complain about this. He could not eat her bread the way he had as a hungry hatchling. He was large enough now that his dietary needs required real ore and deep-ground minerals the way adult HFY needed them. But he still came to the yard, and Nora still set out a loaf on the sill, and he still took it, not because it fed him in any serious sense, because it was warm, and it was Nora's, and some things do not need a better reason than that. Kale came less often. He had duties and a clan life that needed him. But when he came, he and Nora sat in the yard in the evenings and talked in the unhurried way of people who have moved past the stage of trying to understand each other and have arrived at the simpler stage of simply being comfortable in the same space. He had stopped pretending he did not eat her bread. 3 journalists came again in the 4th month, a different 3. Nora gave them roles and sent them away. A 4th journalist came alone, a young woman who did not try to interview Nora, but instead sat down at a table in the bakery front room, ordered a slice of bread with butter, and ate it quietly. After a while she said, "I'm not here to write about you. I just wanted to see where it happened." Nora looked at her. She refilled the young woman's water. She asked where what happened. The journalist looked at her bread for a moment. She said, "The thing that changed how 2 species talk to each other." Nora went back to her work. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "I made bread. I heard something cold and I fed it. That is all that happened here." The journalist looked at her for a long time and did not write anything down. Then she paid for her bread and left. She wrote the piece anyway, later, from memory. It was short. It said that in a small bakery on the outer edge of explored space, an elderly woman had done the thing that nations and committees and decades of diplomacy could not do, not by strategy, not by negotiation, but by opening a door. The piece ran in 17 different language editions. It was the most read Outer Rim story in the Cooperative Broadcast Network's history for the quarter in which it was published. Nora never read it. The phrase traveled farther than the piece did. Not the formal version, not she fed the cold in the old HFY tongue, though that traveled too. But the simpler version, the one that moved across colony networks and ship crews and station populations, the version without ceremony. It went like this. "Did you hear what happened on Harveth? An old woman opened her back door and found a dragon, and she fed it. That was all, she just fed it." People told it to each other the way people tell small true stories that carry something larger inside them. They told it in break rooms on mining stations and in the corridors of medical ships and in the long shared bunks of transport freighters running slow routes through the outer sectors. They told it when things felt too complicated, when the news was too large, and the problems too old, and the distance between people and species felt like something that could not be crossed. An old woman, a dragon, bred. On 17 different worlds, in 16 different languages, this became a way of saying, sometimes the answer is simple, sometimes you just have to open the door. Nora did not know any of this. She did not follow the broadcasts. She got up before dawn every day, walked her 12 steps to the bakery, started her oven. The firestone from Sarath glowed in the oven's core with its steady, deep warmth, patient and permanent, the way only very old things can be patient. The bread rose the way it always had. The colony came in for their morning loaves, flour-dusted and warm, and Nora handed them over the counter and said the same things she had always said, and the days were the same in all the ways that made them good. One morning, a few weeks into winter, she was standing at her back window before the sun came up, as she sometimes did in the early dark when the flour was measured and the oven was warming and there was a quiet moment before everything began. The wheat field beyond the fence was silver with frost. The sky was the very dark blue that comes just before light decides to arrive. A shape moved in the sky above the plains. Large, easy, a long, slow circle, not hunting, not traveling, just moving the way things move when they are young and have enough strength in their wings and want to use it. Drail. He made one wide circle over the bakery, low enough that his wingbeat pushed the frost off the grass below. Then he rose higher, turning toward the dark ridge in the east, where the Vorkai nesting grounds began and the stone crags held the early cold. Nora watched until he was a shape, and then a point, and then gone. She turned back to her oven. The firestone pulsed its steady warmth. She put her hands in the flour. She had bread to make. She always had bread to make. And somewhere out there, in the slow turning of that frontier world and the wider turning of the galaxy beyond it, something had come loose that had been stuck for a very long time. Not because anyone had planned it, not because anyone had seen it coming, because one woman, in the dark hour before sunrise, had picked up a warm loaf and opened a door. That was all. That was enough.